I love bulbs, and I haven't ordered mine yet for this year. I'm woefully behind, but I hope to get some planting in yet. And you'll be happy to know that as long as you can find the bulbs, you can plant them farther into the fall than you might think. So this is what we're going to be talking about today. The when to plant, like I was just mentioning, where to plant and how to plant, and then just a little bit about bulb maintenance. If you want to learn more about bulbs, I will be doing a 2-hour talk on them for my Green Thumb gardening course. So you can find information on that at the Dane County Extension website. And if you just go under the Horticulture tab and classes, you can find out more about bulbs. So here we go. All right, so I live in the southern part of the state. So in my part of the state, the best time to start planting bulbs is early to mid-October. You don't want to do it much earlier than that because then the soil temperature is too cold. Now, or sorry, too warm. If you're farther up north, then you might actually have to have started planting sooner. Depending on when you usually get your first fall freeze. But most bulbs are going to need a 12 to 16 week chilling period, and that means that they need to have that long at about 35 to 38 degrees. Ideally, if you're not forcing your bulbs in the refrigerator and you're putting them in the ground, you want to have that temperature go down slowly. So they have their first 3 to 5 weeks developing their roots at 45 to 50 degrees, and then the next 3 weeks at 38 to 42. So you can see the temperatures going down, and then the remainder of that at about 35. If they don't get enough chilling, if you've ever had your bulbs come up with really short stems, that is one of the things that can cause that, is that they didn't get enough chilling time. Now, this is a question that I frequently get in the spring. Lisa, I didn't get my bulbs planted last fall. What do I do? And my response is usually, I hope you didn't leave them in an unheated garage, because that's not the best thing to do. But keeping them cold is fine as long as they don't get frozen and they don't dry out. So if you do find yourself in that situation, you can leave your bulbs in the box in a refrigerator, or you can plant them up like this person has done, and you get your chilling hours through that refrigeration. And again, make sure to leave them in there for 12 to 16 weeks. And if your bulbs are sharing space with other things like food items in your refrigerator, make sure that you don't store them near fruit. As fruit ripens in your refrigerator, it produces ethylene gas, which can have a bad effect on your bulbs. So don't store them near apples or other things that you might be refrigerating. Okay, so that's when to plant. Now we'll talk about where to plant. So most of our bulbs actually come from areas of the world, particularly the Middle East, where they are in conditions that are moist in spring, but in summer it's hot and dry. And they generally are going to be growing in gritty or rocky soils. We also have some that come from Europe in kind of alpine meadow situations, or mountaintops that have, fairly rocky soil. So the take home here is that bulbs need good drainage. So when you're thinking about where to plant, especially down here in the southern part of the state where we have a lot of heavy clay, it can be kind of tough to figure out where to plant. because our bulbs often don't survive well in heavy clay soils, and particularly heavy clay soils that are not well drained. Another thing that can happen is that people put them in well-drained soils, but then they plant annuals or perennials that need a lot of water right next to them. And so they end up getting too wet anyway. And when the bulbs are in heavy clay soils and or too wet, you tend to get rot. They don't have the oxygen that they need, and they start to rot in the soil. So you want to avoid any low spots where water tends to collect. And again, that heavy clay soil, if you can avoid that too, is the thing to do. Now, most of our bulbs, our tulips and our daffodils, need at least 4 to 6 hours of sun. However, if you want to plant them someplace where they get 4 to 6 hours of morning sun or 4 to 6 hours of afternoon sun, that's fine. If they get more than 6 hours, that's even better. But a corollary is that the flowers will actually last a little bit longer, especially if we have a hot spring, if they're not in sun in the middle of the day. So that could mean that you have a place where they get morning sun but afternoon shade. And then, of course, there are species like the hyacinthoides that are in this picture here that will tolerate quite a bit of shade, especially high canopy like under oaks or under a sugar maple or birch or honey locust, any of those plants that have less of a really dark, dense leafy canopy. So if your bulbs bloom early in the year, anemone comes to mind, or glory of the snow, or snowdrops, those can live under deciduous trees quite nicely because in general, they'll have come up, flowered, and gone dormant by the time the canopy really fills in. However, not all of them are really happy about root competition. So if you have a really large tree with an aggressive network of roots, such as silver maples, those can be a problem for our daffodil bulbs and tulip bulbs, hyacinth, etc. However, interestingly, a lot of the smaller bulbs like pushkinia or crocus can do okay under that type of root competition. Another thing to check, and if you haven't had a soil test done ever, I do recommend having one done. Most of the bulbs will do quite well if your pH is between 6 and 7. Now, we have a lot of alkaline soils, especially here in the southern part of the state, so your pH may actually be more like 7.5 or even possibly 8. And if that is the case, you may have to either try and amend your soil, which can be difficult to do, or figure out another way, perhaps make a berm that you plant your bulbs in, or grow your bulbs in pots. Another thing to look for is if you happen to have a black walnut in your yard, or if your nearby neighbor has a black walnut. Roots from trees can extend anywhere from 3 to 5 times the height of the tree. Now, as the roots get smaller and finer, it becomes less of a problem with the exudate that black walnut roots put out. That's called juglone, and it is a chemical that will inhibit or suppress the growth of other plants. Not all other plants. There are plenty of natives that will do quite nicely under black walnuts, but a lot of our bulb species are not resistant to that juglone exudate and shouldn't be planted near black walnuts. That being said, there are also quite a number that are resistant. So you might want to look into one of those species. Now with the alliums, it's kind of a mixed bag. Those are the ornamental onions. Some of them may be resistant and others not. And it's really hard to find that information. So if you're somebody that loves alliums and you do have a black walnut, I'd be sparing in the amount that you plant until you can determine whether they're going to do well for you in that area. Okay, so we covered when to plant and where to plant. And now we'll talk about actual planting and how to do it. So a really kind of, not to make a horticultural pun, but quick and dirty guideline is to plant the bulbs 2 to 3 times as deep as the bulb is tall. So you measure from the bottom of the bulb to the top of the bulb, and then you multiply that by 2 or 3 times. If your soil is heavier, you can go more towards the 2 end. If your soil is more well drained and or sandy, then I would put it a little bit deeper. But I love this particular chart because it is nice and visual, and it covers a whole lot of different species, and it covers ones that are rhizomes as well as what we would typically call bulbs. So the rhizomes would be things like bearded iris or crested iris. And we also have some of the like canna roots and dahlia tubers, etc. So this is a nice chart that I think gives you good information. That being said, the other thing, if you just want to keep this in mind, is larger bulbs should be 6 to 8 inches deep. Well, what's a larger bulb? A larger bulb would be a good-sized tulip bulb or daffodil bulb. Those are considered some of the larger bulbs. You might also put some hyacinth into that category and some of the alliums as well. Your smaller bulbs would be ones like crocus and glory of the snow and snowdrops and pushkinia. Any of those are smaller bulbs. And so you want to space your larger bulbs. You can see here in this trench, you can put them fairly close together, especially if you've got like a 12-inch diameter hole. You should be able to fit 10 bulbs in there, especially if they're not, you know, really big daffodil bulbs, fairly comfortably. You don't want them on top of each other, but you do want it to look natural. You want it to look like a clump. One of the things that I don't recommend doing is planting like little soldiers in a row. That tends to not look very natural, and the bulbs can't help each other hold their foliage up either. So better to plant them closer than not. And as I mentioned, in groups works nicely. Now, this is a row, but you have many individual bulbs in that trench. Good news is if you're planting the small bulbs, they don't need orienting. Back when I was in the landscaping industry, we would grab handfuls of crocus, etc., and we had a 2-person planting system. I was usually the one on my knees, which is probably why my knees are not so good now. But I would be crawling along with these handfuls of small bulbs. Somebody else would dig in, lift up the shovel. I'd hurl the bulbs in there, and then the person would pat the soil down and on we'd go. And we could plant a couple thousand bulbs that way before lunch. Now we had to be a little carefuler with the larger bulbs. You want to make sure the apex is pointing up and the roots are pointing down. But it was an efficient way to plant. Now, some rhizomes, such as these Virginia bluebells, are kind of hard to figure out. They don't look like a typical bulb, and what you need to do is try and locate a little sprout that's coming up or a little bud, and that should be as close to the surface as possible. But I've sat there myself going, which, flipping this this rhizome over and over and going, okay, which side is up? So do if you're planting those kinds of plants, do look for the buds. And if your soil is very dry, which in most parts of the state, we are quite dry now, do water your bulbs in. If the soil is very moist, you probably don't have to, especially if you've got heavier soil. If you've got sandier soil, I'd water it in anyway. Now, a lot of media will tell you to use bone meal with bulbs, but it really is not all that it's cracked up to be, and it may attract pests. Skunks, possums, dogs are all attracted by bone meal, and if they can smell it, they will try and dig up your bulbs. It's really better to use a slow release fertilizer in spring when the bulbs are actively growing and they can actually use that fertilizer. Okay, how to plant. You certainly can do this, but it does take a lot more bending and digging than one large hole or a trench. And especially if you've got heavy soil, you need to clean the soil from the ring for each bulb. And it's not an inexpensive tool, and it's hard to use in heavy clay. This is not my favorite tool for bulb planting, and I don't really recommend using that. Now, this is, if you don't like digging holes, but you want to drop in individual bulbs, you can use a bulb auger. Some of the bulb companies do carry these, but you can also get them at home improvement stores. If you have really heavy clay, it may not work very well. But if you have average soil, it should be just fine. The one problem is, of course, as this gentleman is bending over, you have to stay bent over for a long period of time. And if your back is like mine, that may not be the best way to do things. I mentioned the two-person planting system. If you do have a person who can help you, I do recommend that as a very fast and efficient way to do it. Now, if you happen to have rodents, voles, chipmunks, etc., you may want to use some chicken wire when you plant your bulbs so that they don't get dug up in the fall before they even have a chance to come up in spring. Now, the problem with this is that you need to watch very carefully in spring because those bulbs are going to come up, and you can see on the kind of the right-hand side there, there's a bulb that the leaves are already getting too big to go through the chicken wire, so you don't want to damage the leaves. You can also use, when the bulbs come up, you can use rodent repellents. There are various brands on the market. I would test them on just a couple of plants first, because some bulb foliage is not very, it doesn't handle the repellents very well necessarily. So I would check a few before doing the whole bunch. If you do have rodents, daffodil bulbs and leaves are poisonous, so they tend to get eaten a lot less often than do tulips and some other bulbs. Onions, ornamental onions, are generally left alone as well, and hyacinths. For some reason, they don't seem to like hyacinths very well. So those are all good strategies if you happen to have rodents. Just a little bit here about maintenance. Unfortunately, bulbs do come with bulb foliage, and there's always the, what do I do with this nasty looking bulb foliage? Unfortunately, you should not do the bulb bondage thing that is pictured below. That tends to not allow the bulb to produce as much food through photosynthesis to support itself in proceeding years. So if you cut the foliage off, or if you do the bulb bondage thing, you may not get as many blooms in the future. So what you can do is you can kind of gently bend the foliage over, or you can use landscape staples, or you can bend wire to kind of hold it down so that it's not quite so visible. But usually you should wait until into early June at least before cutting that back. And over time, bulbs will get crowded. They'll start to flower less. And fall is a great time to divide them if you can find them. Usually, if I'm planning on dividing bulbs, I'll either put a little landscape flag in that I know where they are over the season, or you can do it right after the leaves die down so that you know where they are in order to divide them. And division is fairly simple. You just pull apart the bulbs and plant them a little farther apart. So you can either do it late spring, or you can do it in the fall. If you do it in late spring and you're wanting to move them somewhere else, you can also store them for a while in a cool, dry area. And that is that. I think we've got about 5 minutes or so for questions. And I'll be happy to try and answer those.
Great. Thank you so much, Lisa. I also would just like to mention that we do have a survey that we would love for people to take. If you could take a moment after this program ends, that survey link will be in the chat. It will also pop up on your screen after the webinar ends. I'll put that in the chat again. If you do have some questions, please make sure to put them in the Q&A so I can get to them. And we do have some. This meeting or this program is being recorded. We are going to have it available probably next week once we post it to our Extension Horticulture website. Okay, so I think you went through all of this great information about bulbs. I'm going to start here because you had just mentioned kind of dividing and moving and the timing for that. But someone had to move some bulbs in late August because they were having some construction, you know, that happens in the summer, right? We're doing construction around our porches and garages and things.
Yep.
They said they immediately transplanted them and have watered them. Is that okay?
You did the right thing. Sounds like you got them at a good time, and yeah, now is the perfect time to do that.
Good. Let's see, there's been a few questions about deer. Do you know, are there any bulbs that maybe are a little bit more deer resistant?
Yeah, so daffodils are generally deer resistant. Ornamental onions are also generally resistant, and hyacinths. All of those seem to be less attractive to deer. They do love the tulips and a number of the others.
Great, thank you. Let's see. There's a question about that wire mesh to protect the bulbs. Where do you position that? Do you position directly on top of the bulbs or closer to the surface?
Yeah, you lay it on the surface of the soil after you've planted the bulbs. And then you can use, they're called sod staples or landscape staples, to hold the mesh down, or you can use bricks if you happen to have bricks. And then you just lift it up in the spring after the leaves have started to come up. Basically, you're wanting the bulb to have some time in the fall to root itself in so that it can't be easily dug up and carted away.
And then how long for watering, Lisa? Should bulbs be should we continue to water them through the fall and after planting until, you know, or for how long, or until it
Yeah.
freezes, or?
Yeah, I wouldn't say that you need to do it like we do with evergreens where we're, watering into November. Um, Remember that they don't like it too moist, but if it's powder dry like it is right now, I would at least do it into October. Now, I wouldn't water it as often as you're watering your perennials or your evergreens, but if notice that it's getting really dry, then they do need moisture in order to root properly. So I'd check it once a week. You don't, again, want it too wet. Maybe a couple times a month may be good enough. But if you have sandier soil or really dry soil, you may need to do it more often.
Okay, great. We'll keep going with a few more questions here.
Sure.
Um, let's see. Someone asked if they could plant bulbs now in a planter and store them in the unheated detached garage. And then
Yeah,
do I water them?
yeah, you definitely water them. I guess what I would do is if you have like a styrofoam cooler, you could put the pots in there. And what you don't want is to have them freeze in a small pot. And you also don't want them to get completely dry. So the idea is that you're keeping them ideally a couple of degrees, above freezing, and you're not watering if you can help it, but if they start to get really dry, then you do need to do that.
Great. There are a couple of questions about when you have, I think somebody asked about, there's a lot of questions here, I'm paging through. The gladiolas, the little tiny bulbs that start to grow along the sides, and somebody asked about the little tiny bulbs. Do
Oh,
those,
yeah, the
do those
cormels.
need, do those need a chilling period as well before planting?
Hmm. Now that's a good question. Usually the bulbs that you buy in the greenhouse have already been, um, well, I mean, you don't have to do anything more with them
Mhm.
other than plant them. Um, Unless, of course, you're going to be forcing them, and then, you do need to provide that artificial period. Um, so with the cormals, I don't know for sure. I would imagine that you would plant them at the same time that you plant the other bulbs and do the separation at that time. So this time of year, I'd have to look that up though to be sure.
Okay. Well, we're always learning here with our gardening, right?
Uh-huh.
So,
Nobody knows it all.
and there's always new things to learn with all the different things out there. So I thank you for everybody to joining. Thank you everybody for joining us. Thank you, Lisa, for once again sharing your knowledge. I'm sorry we didn't get to some of your questions, folks, but you can certainly use our Ask a Gardening question form from our website. I'm going to drop the link to the survey once more into the chat, and I will send you on your way. Go enjoy the sunshine and think about planting those bulbs this fall. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Julie.